Good morning. My name is Toms Baumanis. I'm Vice Rector of Riga University and former Chairman of Latvian Transatlantic Organization, and my pleasure is to welcome all of you today on behalf of organizers to Riga Conference 2022. In recent history, we have experienced a lot. The return of Eastern Europe to Europe after joining NATO and EU, Russia's aggression against Georgia in 2008, annexation of Crimea in 2014, and since February 24th of this year, we have been witness to the full-scale Russian military aggression against Ukraine. Despite appeasements towards Russia and political correctness that was determined by economic interests and conformity of political elites, full scale of war has returned to Europe. We can also call this appeasement or political idealism, but in the minds of Baltic nations, political naivety, if you like. Today we all suffer from consequences of flawed policy towards Russia, fueled by a combination of arrogance, vanity, and greed. Objectively, Europe, outside Ukraine, doesn't suffer too much, simply because there is no war in our countries. The energy crisis and rising inflation cannot be compared to suffering of innocent people in Ukraine have to endure every day. Before our eyes, Ukraine has turned from post-Soviet republic into a nation that defends the values of Europe, the values of democratic world, our values in weapons in hand. I think it was not a mistake to admit Eastern Europe to NATO and EU. Rather, it was a mistake to consider Russia as a reliable partner that will follow UN Charter, fulfill international agreements, respect democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and international borders. Where are now these Russlands Versteher? That's the question. Have we learned nothing from mistakes of the past? This is just one of the questions the conference participants will seek answers to during these panel discussions, networking events, and coffee breaks. More than 640 conference guests are here, the same number online from about 40 countries, and more than 90 journalists have registered. During these two-day conferences, we have more than 20 panels, side events, and the Future Young Leaders Forum. We'll cover topics of international security, economic policy concerns. In upcoming sessions, we'll discuss European strategic interests, Germany, the impact of the war, the energy crisis, growing inflation of our countries, Ukraine and Russia, the NATO strategic concept and interests, Arctic and Baltic Sea security, cyber security, data governance, intelligence, NATO threats, and others. We'll also have an online session on global powerhouses organized together with the Global Boston Forum. And we are also very honored this year with a list of speakers, just to name few: Prime Minister of Latvia, Mr. Kariņš, Foreign Minister of Latvia, Mr. Rikēvičs, Valdis Dombrovskis from European Commission, former President of Croatia, Madame Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović, and Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, Baiba Braža, whom you know very well, Defense Minister of Portugal, Madame Helena Carreiras, Defense Minister of Latvia, Foreign Prime Minister of Sweden, and many others distinguished scholars, experts, and analysts. And please excuse me for not being able to name all of them here. Someone said on Facebook that Riga Conference is an event we attend a celebration for foreign and security experts. We may have different expectations, including the joy of celebration, networking, holidays, intellectual exchange, active group learning, or Riga sightseeing, and I hope your expectations will be fulfilled. Now, let me please welcome the first panel with the President of Latvia, Mr. Egils Levits, with the chairman of Munich Security Conference, Amb Dr Heusgen, his former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and our moderator, Madame Sandra Kalniete. I also would like to underline that Sandra Kalniete was a popular activist who worked very much for revival of Latvian statehood. In 1988, she was elected as deputy chairwoman on the board of Latvian People's Front. She was also responsible for revival of foreign ministry and has had a long career in diplomacy. Sandra was appointed ambassador to the United Nations in France. She was a foreign minister from 2002 to 2004, and since 2009, she has been member of the European Parliament. Madame Kalniete, floor is yours. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Toms, for this very general introduction of me. It was too much, but I also would like to thank you for outlining the scope of the discussion of this year's conference and saving me from the lengthy explanation of why in this opening session we will not debate in depth Russian aggression against Ukraine and issues like climate change or migration. Dear all, in this opening panel we will discuss how to navigate the balance between realpolitik versus idealpolitik after the 24th of February. And the panelists of opening session are outstanding personalities. And I have immense pleasure to present to you, to repeat what Tom's already said, the President of Latvia, former Prime Minister of Sweden, Carl Bildt, and Chair of Munich Security Conference, Amb Dr Christoph Heusgen. Let's look back in the previous conference, Riga Conference. At the conference, the Prime Minister Krišjānis Kariņš, he spoke about 8 challenges the EU is facing in coming years. Allow me to remind you the list: pandemics, the potential escalation of conflict in Ukraine, democracy challenged by autocratic regimes, dependency on one energy supplier, climate policy, Russia, China, and transatlantic relations. A year later, these issues are still there. Yet, in addition, we are facing a war in Europe, which is fundamentally altering the international order. There are so many issues that we need to contend with. In other words, we are still at the very beginning of grappling with the magnitude of the problems we face globally. Mr. President, when we take a global view, democracy and the rule of law are in retreat in many parts of the world. There is fight between democracies and autocratic regimes, dictatorships. Totalitarian states like Russia and China are strengthening their foothold in Africa, Latin America, and using hybrid warfare instruments to destabilize governments, capture political elites, expand influence, extract resources, and strengthen non-democratic regimes. Mr. President, what can democracy do more to effectively counter the autocratic temptations supported by Russian and Chinese interference in the global south, and not only there?
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, first I welcome all participants to this Riga Conference. The main conference of this kind in Europe is Munich Security Conference, and you are also here. But there are a few regional conferences also in Europe, and the Riga Conference is one of the most important regional conferences on security issues. The title of this panel is Realpolitik versus Idealpolitik. And I would define these two kinds of politics as follows. First, ideal politics, or politics of ideals, I would say, is to set goals which are in line with our values. Our values, or values in general, are in principle axiomatic, are not questioned further. We have our values, and then ideal politics is to set these values as goals of our politics, goals for diplomacy, for foreign policy, and so on. Real politics is, in the best sense of the word, is practical politics, how to achieve these goals, which are in line with our values. And there is, of course, danger of hypocrisy, that we are sometimes betraying our goals, our ideals, and this is, this is of, excuse me, this is of course then compromising the ideal politics. And this is also the case in the relation between the so-called West and so-called Global South. 2 years ago, the title of the Munich Security Conference was Westlessness. So that means global world without visible West. West was there, but visible West. So without a specific profile, or this profile was disappearing from also in time, if we compare it maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I think this actual crisis shows that the West is again there on the stage. It is also more than only Europe, and more than only Europe and North America, which are members of NATO and other European states, but also includes, it was, I think, symptomatic that in the NATO summit in June, also 4 other states were invited, Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. I think it is a demonstration of the West. It is not complete. There are more states which are sharing the same values as we Europeans. And we should make this West more visible. Why it is important? Because the Global South, Latin America and Africa and Asia, is also in searching of their values and their place in the world. And we should recognize the just assertions of Global South, but also to deny or not to agree with certain demands or politics which are against that. I think we should, at the first, the first point is to be sure of our values. We should define it, be sure, and demonstrate it. And then we can say that the Global South has also some just demands. For example, climate issues. The so-called West is polluting much more than the third, I wanted to say third world, but the new term is Global South. Also, and we should recognize just demands. Also, global justice is one issue we should take is as one of our foreign politics goals. But also there are several issues which we cannot agree, and we should also to say this openly. For example, Europe and also US and Canada are, I think, bringing 90% of development aid in the world. And it is taken as granted. I think we should cope with we should link this development aid with good governance, and it would show that it is much more effective if the good governance would be introduced in development aid. Also, concerning Chinese influence, I think we should say that not China is giving also the main development aid without conditions to the benefit of this country. There are very egoistic part of Chinese influence investments, and Europe is doing so rather for ideal reasons, not so much also for real economic reasons, but also for ideal reasons. And this is one point which is different from European development aid and China. So I think, and the third, and I will conclude, the third point is Ukraine. We see that there are some hesitations to recognize clearly who is the aggressor and who is the victim. But it is absolutely clear from the point of view of international law and international peace order and multilateralism. And I would say we should convey this message also for the Global South, and to try to explain why it is in the interest of the Global South, and I would say for all countries in the world, for all 192 countries which are members of the United Nations, to maintain this international order, which is based on international law, because without such a kind of order, there would be a military and aggressive chaos in the world. And it is in each country, and I would say also independently from the state form, also autocratic states are interested in world peace and involved in international law. I think I will stop here concerning this relations between the global West or European Union in most narrow sense to the global South. Thank you.
So, thank you, Mr. President, for assuring us that West is back. Before I would ask Ambassador Heusgen to elaborate on Westlessness, I would like to mention that there are several coincidences linking you and Mr. President. You were both born at the same year. Then you spent your green years in North Westphalia, and you both, being in Germany, experienced the fall of Berlin Wall. I presume that it had a major influence on your formation as personality and diplomat deeply rooted in democratic Western values. And so, Mr. Ambassador, as President already mentioned 2 years ago in Munich Security Conference, spoke of Westlessness. Of course, we are now in a rapidly transforming world, as Putin's invasion in Ukraine has completely altered the security landscape and revived fears of nuclear conflict. Furthermore, on November 15th, there are midterm elections to the US Congress, and Trump is preparing his comeback. In your view, Ambassador, has the collective support for Ukraine sufficiently galvanized transatlantic alliance to overcome such Westlessness? Is it still a relevant label?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'd like to make 3 remarks. First, it's wonderful to be in Riga. I was here with Chancellor Merkel as her advisor first time in 2006 for the NATO summit. And at that time, Riga for me was kind of a sleeping beauty. Now, on the advice of my friend, the Latvian ambassador to New York, Andres, who I asked what to do here and where to run, he told me I should run along the canal, which I did this morning, and I must say it's just absolutely beautiful, and it's a wonderful city. And again, thank you very much for having me. Number two, Westlessness, West, and what the president said. I hardly ever use the expression West anymore, because coming from this experience as 4 years of ambassador at the UN, when you talk about the West and about the Western values, the countries of the global South tell you, well, you know, what does the West stand for? The West stood and defended the US intervention in Iraq, which was the second war was against international law. The West stands for, Latin American ambassadors say, well, how about, you know, the invasion in Panama and Grenada and Nicaragua? These were all violation of international law. And there are many examples where Western countries are violating international law, and we are accused of double standards, and we have to be aware of this. And therefore, I think we should continue to do and emphasize what the president said at the end of his remarks, and this is, we have to stand for the rules-based international order. We have to stand for the UN Charter. We have to stand for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. These are universal values. These are everybody in the United Nations signed up to this, and this is what we have to stand for. And this is where we then have, and this is my third remark, have to work together. We have to work together as a West. Yes, I think the alliance is working perfectly. I think when you look at the different packages of sanctions, we stand together, we do a lot in terms of military aid, but we are not doing enough yet. As Europeans, we have to step up to the place more. My country has, I mean, we took the decision in 2014 already in the Wales summit to spend 2% on defense, but we didn't deliver. Now we have a decision to spend 100 billion on defense. We have to deliver in our country, and we have to do more in Europe, because while right now the relationship with our American friends is at its best, I think we have not had over the last years or decades even a closer relationship as we have with the Biden administration. But I don't know if you have seen this, but when the former President Trump's campaigns, he is now campaigning and saying, well, should we spend so much money on Ukraine? Shouldn't we rather spend it on domestic issues? So we have to, in any case, we have also to do our homework, we have to spend. And on the global South, we have to pick up the fight with China. Let's be honest on this. I have seen it at the UN that African ambassadors read Chinese speaking notes, even if they get a lot of development aid from us. And what you said before, yes, we are idealistic, but in the end, it counts when, you know, when the votes are counted at the UN, and when it comes about, will we defend an order that is based on the Charter and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or will in the end we have votes in the General Assembly where Chinese values get a majority, and then they'll turn around and say, why don't you now follow the rule of law? And this is sovereignty first and human rights second. And therefore I see the Vice President of the Commission here, Mr. Dombrovskis, who I had the pleasure to work with for many, many years in different functions. The global gateway problem is the right thing, but we have to get it on the ground. What I read is that still a lot of things in the European Commission with regard to how do we deal. We have to get it on the ground. We have to act, otherwise China is winning this game.
Thank you, Ambassador, and thank you for reminding us about China's immense influence in Global South. And if I may express my wish to Germany, to the government of Germany, that in its trying to escape one immense mistake, making itself dependent on one
I'm not
supplier.
part of the government
I know
anymore,
that you are
so.
not, but you can pass the message. They would not make themselves and Germany and German people and also Europe dependent on the other giant, global giant, and not a democratic country. Thank you, dear Carl Bildt. First, congratulations on your recently published book, My Wars. I personally, and I believe that international society...
It's in Swedish.
I know, that's what I'm going to say, that we all are impatiently waiting it to be translated into English. And I hope you will do that, because if it's translated into Latvian, we would be happy to accept it, but what about others? So, but let me say again how grateful we are in the Baltic states for your strong support of restoration of our independence. I still vividly remember your visit to Latvian Popular Front headquarters and our conversations there. And it was a very bold message for international community still hesitating to de facto recognize independence of Baltic states. And during your long political career, you have always stood on the right side of history, and you are doing so once again by supporting Ukraine today. And again about Putin, he is not only waging military aggression against Ukraine, but also escalating an energy war against the entire European Union. And there is a clear and urgent momentum to divest from Russian oil and gas, and Europe is searching for alternative suppliers elsewhere, all around the world. And at the same time, this difficult adaptation is forced to take place simultaneously with long-term transition to sustainable energy. And my question to you is, how should Europe navigate the geopolitical dilemmas of cooperation with non-democratic regimes? How can we find right balance between realpolitik and the risks involved to lose the value compass when we are seeking new resources for our energy?
Thanks, and great to be in Riga. As you pointed out, I've been here before, mildly speaking. On our sort of energy policy and values, I don't think you can accuse our energy policies in the past for having been particularly value-driven. We got the Norwegians, thanks, that can supply something, but otherwise, let's be honest. Europe, the US, has been dependent upon a couple of less democratic regimes in the Arabian Peninsula that are not sort of standard bearers of our values. And we still are to some extent. And they are not advocating our interests. Look at what the Saudis did the other day. First, they sort of invite the American president to come there, and he goes there and be somewhat humiliated. And he wanted them to take down the oil prices. Then they line up with the Russians and increase the oil prices, or seek to increase the oil prices. That's the way the world is, and we are dependent upon the energy. We are, as long as we have this energy dependence, and we'll have it for a long time, let's be realistic, we have to have, it's got to be a more interest-driven approach than a value-driven approach. The problem with the gas dependence on Russia was less than that Russia was a nasty regime. It was less nasty in those days when those contracts were signed, let's be honest. But the problem was that we were too dependent upon them. And the same we have, of course, with these particular regimes that I mentioned. That is a major problem. And we will have it further on, to be quite realistic. We're now having an energy transition, hopefully, non-fossil fuels. Well, where do we get the cobalt? Where do we get the rare earth minerals? I wish they were from Norway, or Denmark, to be generous. But they are not. They're also coming from parts of the world that are somewhat problematic. The God Almighty, when he once upon a time distributed the energy resources of the world, wasn't value-driven, obviously. I'm not holding it against him, but it is problematic. But let me finally just say a couple of remarks quickly on the other point. I agree, the West is back. I agree with Christoph as well. The West is not white as snow in terms of our history, and we should be somewhat careful with it. But no question, the West is back. The Atlantic West primarily. The East, I would argue, is in trouble. West is back, and the East is trouble. And the South is divided, I would argue. The East is in deep, the part of East that is Russia is in deep, probably terminal trouble. The Chinese are in trouble, and I would say that the Chinese and the Russians are in trouble for the same reason, different troubles, as to be said, for the same reason. Two authoritarian regimes, when you concentrate too much power in an individual, that individual tends to make major mistakes. Putin has made an insane decision. Xi Jinping has made a couple of decisions that has taken China on the wrong trajectory. So the East is in trouble, if we look at it in the longer term. The South is divided, we should not forget that. If we take the Southern Hemisphere, two of the biggest countries, or perhaps even the two biggest countries, if you take the Southern Hemisphere in geographical terms, are Indonesia and Brazil. They are on our side on this particular thing. The Indians are wavering, and a lot of Africans, as Christoph said, on the other side. But it's not that the South is united. The South is divided, the East is in trouble, and the West is back, would be my slightly simplistic summary of the global situation. And the North is cold.
Thank you. I love your expression that God was not value-driven when he distributed the energy resources on the globe. But it reassures me, and I believe also your assessment that West is back. Unfortunately, East is in trouble and South is divided. So, but for us, the most important is that we are back and we are conscious who we are and what we want to do. I hope we are. So thank you for being so, let's say, pertinent and straight. Mr. President, again, it's to you. When we speak of foreign security policy here in the Baltic states, a term often evoked is windows of opportunity. We all know that the first major historic window of opportunity enabled us to restore our independence. And the second made it possible for us to join EU and NATO. And do you think that Putin's aggression against Ukraine has potentially presented us with yet another window of opportunity to reimagine Europe, including by advancing in integration process of countries like Ukraine into EU and NATO? And then I also would like to ask, will Europe be brave and ambitious enough to seize this window of opportunity? How can we ensure that it is not wasted? Many already suggest that one of the consequences of this war will be the formation of a second European center of gravity in Central Eastern Europe, to go along with the traditional Franco-German axis. Do you share this assessment, Mr. President?
Yeah, thank you. I am particularly thankful to Carl Bildt on his picture, because of his picture that the West is back and the East is in trouble. And this is also a kind of window of opportunity for the West. The main slogan, general slogan of the West in the beginning of the 2000s was globalization. Now, I think the main slogan, I would say, is resilience. Resilience of our democracies, of our values, of our way of life. You know that Mr. Dombrovskis' colleague is, as a commissioner, responsible for European way of life. This is a kind of portfolio in the European, in European Commission. But this is seriously because we want not to change our system, but to develop our systems. There is no attractivity to maybe to Chinese to Chinese system in Spain or in Latvia or in other countries, but vice versa it is. There are this soft power of Western values. And I would say that this is also a window of opportunities to, in order to make more resilient or resilient our Western system, also to take on the board as such countries which are ready and willing to join the Western values. And of course, European Union is one very reliable Western Union. European Union is a very reliable instrument to do that. We can see that after 2004, when 10 new member states joined European Union, also it is not only an economic and political result for that, but also the values. I think there is, of course, to take over the values, it is not for 1 year, but for 10, for 20 years. And in Europe, West includes also the previous eastern part of Europe. And I think we should go further. It is our strategic goal. If we want to be resilient and if we are believing in our system, and this is so, whether it would be the case, I am a little bit, so to say, not very optimistic, but in general optimistic. I think it is in long term or in middle term not avoidable. We should help Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova, of course, to join the European Union. We should take the candidate status seriously, not as I would say it was the case with Turkey since 60 years. We should take this seriously and to help to manage all the necessary reforms. Yeah, but one small point again. We should prepare also the European Union for the enlarged number of member states. Because currently it is maybe on the limit, 27 member states, and if we would have 30 and more, it would be difficult. I should mention also Western Balkans. Also, there are 5 candidate countries. We should reorganize. I will not explain more to that, but we should revisit also decision-making system in the European Union in order to cope with this strategic goal, enlargement of the European Union, which is in the same time included in the more broader goal, resilience of democracy, resilience of the West, and the global at least to keep the influence or the role of the West in global issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President, for bringing in 4 posts the importance of resilience, which for last, let's say, 4 or 5 years, we are beginning to understand the importance of that. And I also thank you for support for enlargement and incorporation to the Union of those countries willing. And you perfectly are right that in long term it is inevitable. It is a strategic goal also for the security, stability and influence of Europe. Thank you. Dear Carl, certainly you know that here in Riga we are absolutely happy and enthusiastic about the news of Swedish decision to apply for NATO membership and also for Finnish, but you are former Swedish Prime Minister. And at the same time, make no mistake, we understand that for Sweden, this represents a shift in policy of truly historic proportions. Sweden remained non-aligned even during the most dangerous years of Cold War. And what I would like to ask you, does Sweden's decision to seek membership in alliance signal that non-alignment is no longer sustainable? Since the return of great power geopolitics, is it possible to remain neutral for a country?
I think we should be aware that the neutrality that different countries have had means very different things to them and has different historical backgrounds. The neutrality or policy of being freedom of alliance in peace, aim at neutrality war, which is the formal one, that Sweden had during the Cold War was, in my opinion, a highly justified policy. It was very much motivated by concern about the position of Finland, because we should not forget that Finland came out of the Second World War. They had been fighting on the side of Hitler. They were under an Allied controlled commission controlled by one of the lieutenants of Stalin. If you look at American diplomatic cables from the time, they were all convinced that Finland would go the way of Czechoslovakia in 1948. So Sweden sort of decided to have that position in order to increase historically the room for maneuver of Finland. You can argue that policy also succeeded. And the historic shift was really when Finland and Sweden joined the European Union in 1995, because then we went into an alliance. The EU is a political alliance. It's not a military alliance. It pretends sometimes, but isn't. And since then, we have been, in my opinion, on a glide path towards NATO that was turbocharged by Mr. Putin the other day. If you look at the Irish neutrality, of course, the historical content is completely different. Has nothing to do with anything of what we are discussing here. If you look at Swiss neutrality, which is perhaps the most sort of intellectually consistent policy of neutrality that you can find, it is very much motivated by the composition of the nation and the surrounding nations, and the risk that if Switzerland was going to take the side in the European wars, it would tear Switzerland apart. So it's a different, Austrian neutrality, I think, defies intellectual description. But I leave that to the Austrians. So what I'm saying is that the world has changed. It's changed fundamentally for Finland and Sweden. Even if you took the Swiss, I was there the other day discussing these things, they now talk about what they call cooperative neutralitet. Cooperative neutrality, I haven't a clue what it is. But it means that they see that you can't be only neutral, you also have to cooperate. So we all have to change. And of course, we are in a situation where, particularly in Europe, the Russian aggression is, of course, an aggression against sort of the fundamental, not only values, that's fairly obvious, but the fundamental interests of any European order of peace. And that, I think, long-term will influence also the Irish or the Austrian or the Maltese or the Cypriot or whatever debate. But leave it to each nation according to their historical backgrounds and their actual geographical situation.
Thank you. Thank you. Cooperative neutrality, I will ask my husband. He is citizen of Switzerland. Okay. He must know it.
It's got to be a long answer.
Yeah, okay. But it's true. I think we all agree that Putin's aggression is against the interest of any country in the European Union, and seeing the food crisis even beyond. It's a global disaster. So thank you for being so pertinent. Christopher Heusgen, some 25 years ago, I served as Latvia's permanent representative to UN in Geneva. And this experience, I regret, made me skeptical about the capacity of UN to be instrumental in maintaining international peace and security, or acting as a center for harmonizing the actions of the nation. Over the last decades, there have been we witnessed numerous unsuccessful initiatives and attempts to reform the UN. Since the founding of the UN, the number of member states have quadrupled, while the Security Council has remained unchanged, 15, including the veto powers for permanent 5, which mostly are blocking any action because of composition of this permanent 5. And Ambassador, drawing to your experience as Germany's permanent representative at the time, and you share some insight already, when you served, Germany served on the UN Council, what can we, democracies, do to revitalize multilateralism in this time of power politics? And how can the UN security be made fit for purpose? I heard that Germany is supporting enlargement of Security Council, so please elaborate on it.
Yes, let me come back to what I said earlier. We need the UN because the UN and the Charter of the UN, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, these are universal laws. If we say we give up on that, we give up on the rule of law as the guiding principle for the world order. So even if we have all these problems, we must not give up. It was the basic condition of US and Russia and China that they joined this international order, that they subscribed to the UN Charter. The condition was that they have a veto right. Otherwise, they would have not signed it. So all the ideas of, well, we should strip Russia of the veto right, yes, I would sign it immediately, but then they would leave the UN and the UN would not have. So we have to continue to try and work with this body. And if we work with this body, we have to engage in the body and we have to try to reform. With regard to engaging in the body, I think for countries, I know that in your country, I've not followed it in detail, but there was a discussion, should Latvia, and I think Latvia is running for the Security Council. I can only ask you to please go forward, because countries like Latvia, and I was served together with Estonia, they have very clear views, they make their views known in the Security Council, and Estonia was one of the most outspoken in the Security Council, for instance, on Russian aggression. And I can imagine that Latvia would do the same already today. Latvia, you know, I'm a bit biased because I'm a friend with your ambassador there, but Latvia, for instance, was a key in promoting a move in the UN to prevent, in the Eastern group, Belarus, to get a seat on the Security Council. It was Latvia that was the driving force. So small countries can do something. People in Germany don't believe that on accountability to prevent impunity. In the UN, it's the country of Liechtenstein that takes the lead. So small countries have a very important role, can play a role. Albania right now did a very important role. So please stay engaged in the UN. Reform of the UN Security Council, if we believe in the UN, if we believe that the legitimacy goes through the Security Council also on security issues, we have to continue to work and reform it. You have to spend a lot of energy, you have to, but one should not give up. And there I come back, I see we don't have much time left, I come back to what I said before. Africa is a continent you mentioned about, you know, the development in the UN after it was founded. Africa is the continent that is less privileged there because no permanent member in Africa. Africa should have every interest to drive the reform process forward. But our Chinese friends succeed in convincing the Africans to slow the process down. This is how far we have gotten. You know, for UN people here, they know this. It's for normal people, you cannot imagine where we stand. China prevents to just have text-based negotiations, that you have a text with different options in there, how to expand, how more permanent members, non-permanent, semi-permanent. China prevents just to have text-based negotiations with the support of Africa, who would benefit most. So we sit here in Riga, we sit in the warm West, so to speak, and we are among like-minded, but there is a very cold wind outside, and we must not be naive on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. I hope we are not naive, and I wish that European countries and other democratic countries, they have enough energy to reform Security Council and to make UN again instrumental to keep the peace. And thank you. I understand that you, as a diplomat and chair of Munich Security Conference, you support Latvia's candidature to the Security Council of UN. But before I will ask about its president, I still would like to address you, Carl. Certainly, you, like we know that recent NATO summit in Madrid adopted a very clear declaration that Russia of today is the greatest threat to security and peace. And in light of recent carpet bombing of Ukrainian cities and civil infrastructure, Russia should be recognized as a terrorist state. And to continue, we must see Ukraine's military victory against Russia as a positive force, which will open a door for Russia's transformation within, which can generate also security on the European continent. But we should not be naive, like Ambassador just said. We will still inherit the threat posed by Russia, a country of 140 million that has been thoroughly poisoned by Putin's regime, Russia's ideology, censorship and repression. Carl, do you have the advice how we must approach the challenge of the de-Putinization of Russia? And do you support the establishment of special international tribunal on the crime of aggression, which will immediately bring to international legal accountability the highest authorities of Russia, including Putin himself? And if I may ask, I would like to ask Ambassador Heusgen to say a few sentences how Germany made this transformation from totalitarian regime to the pillar of democracy in the world. Carl, please.
Well, small questions. So
but the important one.
So, yeah. 2 points, really. One is sort of this accountability for war crimes. Or I start with the other one first. I think we won't get peace in Europe until Russia gives up the imperial temptation and concentrates on building a decent nation state. I think that will happen at some point in time, but it might take a long time. And of course, Russia has all of the conditions for building a nation state. As you say, 140 million people, 11 time zones. It's a big place. You can build a very powerful state out of that. But as long as they believe that they must safeguard some sort of imperial temptation, they will stumble into the one problem after the other, to the detriment of all of us, but also to the fundamental detriment of Russia itself, needless to say, because it takes them off the path of a decent development for their own country. Second, this responsibility in war crimes, I think, is extremely important that we set up some sort of mechanism. It's not easy, preferably a Security Council, not going to happen. So it has to be some other mechanism with as much legitimacy as we can do, both for the ordinary war crimes and for the ultimate war crime of aggression. We should not forget that Nuremberg and Tokyo defined aggression as the supreme crime against international law. above all other war crimes. And no question they are guilty of that. But we should also remember the fundamental principles that we've had before. We don't assign collective responsibility. We assign individual responsibility. We did not make Germany responsible for Hitler. We made the Germans that committed crimes responsible for those particular crimes. We did not make Serbia responsible for Milosevic. We made Milosevic and Mladic and others responsible for the crimes they had committed in the names. And this irrespective of the fact that Hitler did have support in Germany, irrespective of the fact that Milosevic did have support in Serbia. And that is why, from that point of view, long term, also the setting up of mechanisms for accountability is so enormously important for the long term, avoiding the collective responsibility and assigning the individual responsibility. That's sort of a long-term basis for a peace that might, at some point in time, be possible. It's not for next week, to put it mildly.
Thank you.
If I can just add, number one, totally agree. When you look back at the history of my own country, accountability is key. The Nuremberg trials were key. The Nuremberg trials were also giving the example kind of to the International Criminal Court. And we have to have accountability for the war crimes and the crimes against humanity committed by Putin's Russia. Putin will not, as you said, will not go to the International Criminal Court. I think we have to work very hard to set up a special court for the crimes of aggression. And there, again, it's not going to be enough that the Western countries agree. It has to have a mandate by the General Assembly of the UN, and for this to achieve, we have to go out, again, what I said before, we have to invest in Africa, Latin America, Asia, so that we get the votes for the special court. But again, accountability, totally agree, is absolutely necessary. We have, in Germany, we have Nuremberg, but also today we have the principle of universal jurisdiction. We have now, in Germany, had the first people responsible for torture in Syria stand trial in Germany and have been sentenced. So this is number one. Number two, what was important in my country was the individual responsibility, but then a kind of denazification. We need a de-Putinization, as you mentioned before, in Russia's, because I believe today still a large number of Russians support Putin. And I think we have to, somehow it's going to be a long process that people also normally understand the values of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, of democracy, and get away of this view of Russian imperialism. There has to be, as we have in the center of Berlin, right next to the Brandenburg Gate, we have the Holocaust Memorial. And at some stage in Moscow, there has to be a memorial for the victims of Stalinism and Putinism. So we are not there yet, but I think this is... And number three, we were very fortunate in Germany that after the war, instead of Second World War, after putting all Germans in prisons, our American, British, French allies committed to stay in Germany, to help build up a modern country, to help us write a constitution. And, you know, a French President de Gaulle, who was, you know, attacked Germany, occupied France, he said, no, I forgive them. I worked with Konrad Adenauer to build a new Germany, and then the European integration started. And that was the best thing that happened to my country, that then those who won the Second World War said, okay, we're going to help these guys. And this is what I think also we then at some stage, I hope we still live this, Carl, that we can have, you know, open our arms also to Russians.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you. I'm afraid that I will not live as long to see the memorial in the center of Moscow for the victims of Stalin and Putin. But I know that, Mr. President, you want to continue on this subject.
Yeah. I think you both have absolutely right that there is a need for special tribunal on the crime of aggression of Russia against Ukraine. It is not possible by Security Council. Maybe it's possible by General Assembly. We should work on that. But it is in principle possible also by other international organizations like Council of Europe or by a group, possibly large group of like-minded states. This is the possibilities. Why it is important? It is important in order to set clearly that the international law is violated, and you said that the crime of aggression is not comparable with ordinary war crimes which are committed by ordinary soldiers or officers. This is something with the responsibility of the state. And how, what means responsibility of the state? That means, of course, responsible person's responsibility, and also the state is responsible for reparations. And after the Second World War, there was also reparations which Germany should pay to other countries. And I think this is very important also in this case, because a lot of assets are seized outside Russia of $300 or $400 billion in general, and we should work how these assets should be given to the rebuilding of Ukraine. It would take a huge sums, and this is also some kind of, not some kind, but this is a state responsibility, not only to recognize that it was a crime of and responsibility of certain persons, but also this material responsibility. And on last word, there is sometimes to hear objections that Putin will not sit on this court. It is not relevant because we know also court proceedings in absentia, and necessary is a very ordinary, very precise court trial. I think this is in order to give the credibility for this special tribunal, and also to give an example for this global south that yes, we are so on the side of international law, and this is in the interest of all countries.
Thank you. It was not only the president speaking, but it was also a high-level legal expert speaking on international, special international court. I know that we are out of the time, but still, my intention to ask you, Mr. President, about our candidature to the permanent seat of UN Security Council is very high. Okay. Please tell everybody how we are planning to contribute to the UN and to the magnitude of the global problems we are seeing, please.
If he would be elected to
yes,
5.
And we already have almost German support.
So, I think Latvia as a small country has several points to put forward. First, by the global south, also when I come back. Latvia is not involved in the previous colonial politics, colonialism. And I think one important part of the objections, I would say rather, or also unconscious objections against the argumentation of the West is the colonial past. And this creates resentments already generations after. We can see that it is. But Latvia is not part of this colonial history of Europe. Rather in the opposite, that we were colonized to a certain time. So, but this is one. So we can speak relatively free with this global south. Second, we are committed also because of our history to international law. I should not explain this further. This is very important. And this would be, of course, one of the main points of our our politics there.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I would like to apologize for many questions I have seen on this screen, but the discussion was so interesting and passionate that my heart did not allow to cut it short. I thank you all, Carl Bildt, Christoph Heusgen, and Mr. President, you, for this very interesting discussion we had on realpolitik versus idealpolitik. Thank you.